All right, well, good morning, everybody, and thanks again for coming out today as we have a presentation and a little discussion about the Holy Father's Apostolic Exhortation, the letter on marriage and the family. So what I'd like to do is just read my brief statement first and then be very available for any questions or comments you might have. So this is my statement about the Apostolic Exhortation of Pope Francis, Amoris Laetitia. In the publication of his Apostolic Exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, The Joy of Love, Pope Francis has given us a very timely document that deserves our careful and prayerful attention. The letter is written to and about families and seeks to apply the teachings of the Church to the real circumstances of our day. The letter affirms the critical importance of healthy and stable families for our Church and world, while also acknowledging the many difficulties and challenges that families encounter today. It is my intention to form a diocesan task force to study the consequences of Amoris Laetitia and to offer recommendations regarding its full implementation in the Diocese of Providence. While the letter must be considered in its totality, it will be particularly important to study ways of engaging families and individuals for whom the lived experience of family life is far from the ideal proclaimed by the Church, and as a result, sometimes feel estranged from the Church. Her prayer is that every family will be a holy family, and that God's family, the Church, will be a home where all can find a place at the table. May our Blessed Mother, the Virgin Mary, and Saint Joseph, her spouse, accompany us in this exciting journey. So that's a general opening statement, but I welcome any questions or comments you might have. Please.
Bishop Tobin, what do you say to gay Catholics who feel like, while it's a step in the right direction, this does not go far enough, it does not condone marriage between two men and two women?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's true. The document certainly does not condone marriage between homosexual partners, and it makes it very clear that nothing can compare with the ideal of marriage as created by God, as one union, man and woman, a lifetime, permanent, exclusive union. So even though the document is very long, as you can see, it's 200 and some pages and 300 and some paragraphs. It's a very long and nuanced and detailed document. It cannot address every issue, cannot address every topic that comes along. There are only one or two paragraphs in the whole document related to homosexuality and gay marriage. So this is not the primary purpose of the document. The document is meant to be a very positive, joyful, affirming proclamation about marriage and family life as we have it from God. It is a very long document. It's very nuanced, as I said elsewhere. The document's unique in that it has a unique ability to please and disappoint almost everyone who reads it, from every perspective and every angle. So it's a very full document, to be sure.
I would imagine this didn't come as much of a surprise given, what Pope Francis has done in the past 3 years. But what was your initial reaction to reading this and hearing this news this morning?
Well, first I should explain, the bishops, we just received our copy of this yesterday. So I have to be very clear about saying that I have not read the whole document yet. I've read about it. I've read some summaries and some questions and answer formats that's been given to us. So I haven't read the whole document. I guess my first reaction was that it was very long. And there's sort of an inverse proportion between the length of a document and the number of people who will read it. But we'll have a lot of time. We'll have days and weeks and months, years really, to digest everything that's in the document. It's a blueprint. It's a foundation on which we will continue to build. And I think it will guide the pastoral activity of the Church as we deal with marriage and family for many years to come. So it would be a mistake to think that this is something that you can just read and implement and it's done. It'll take a long time to reflect upon this and to understand and to accept all the challenges the Holy Father has given us.
Bishop, you are talking about having a task force that will study this document. Who do you see that might sit on this task force?
At this point, really, I have no idea, except to say that we'll be a mixed committee, including clergy and laity. Certainly, we need to have some members of the laity involved, married couples, singles, divorced people perhaps, those who have all the experiences that Pope Francis talks about in his letter. And the purpose of the task force will be to unpack everything that's in the Holy Father's letter, to help us understand what's in there, and to offer us some practical recommendations going forward as to what the diocese can do to better implement and react to what our Holy Father has done. This is a real challenge for us. It challenges a lot of preconceptions, but I think it's filled with riches and opportunities and blessings if we approach it properly.
Can you clarify what this means for both divorced people and divorced people that have gone on to remarry?
Mm-hmm. Well, the document, of course, has been said by others, it's not primarily a doctrinal statement. It doesn't recast the teachings of the church, the moral teachings of the church. We should be very clear that fornication is still a sin, and adultery is still a sin, and homosexual activity is still a sin, all in the objective order. I think what the Pope is saying, however, is that in situations where people find themselves in those circumstances, we need to walk with them. We need to try to understand them and help them to be integrated into the life of the church and not excommunicate. The Pope is very clear about saying, for example, that those who are divorced and remarried civilly are not excommunicated. They should feel themselves to be part of the church. And the church has a lot to offer them as we welcome them into the communion with the church. So in one sense, it doesn't change the basic teachings of the church or the basic morality of the church, but it is saying that the real lived experience of people is sometimes different than what we would want it to be. And the church has the obligation and the responsibility to reach out to these folks and to accompany them and to try to integrate them into the life of the church to the very, very best of our ability.
So are they welcome to receive communion going forward?
That, of course, is one of the most compelling, most neuralgic issues of the document, one that's received so much discussion during the synods of the last 2 years and even leading up to the document. Pope takes a very careful and prudent and nuanced approach to that topic. He does not open the doors completely for divorced and remarried Catholics to receive Holy Communion. He's pretty clear about that. But he does say that each case is a little bit different, and that individuals who are divorced and civilly remarried are part of the church, and that in conjunction with and consultation with their priest, their pastor, or spiritual director, they have to decide what their participation in the life of the church can be. It will be different for different people in different circumstances, and the Pope recognizes that in his letter. There are different reasons why people get divorced. There are different ways that people respond to that. What about the concern for the children? What's the attitude of the spouse about the teaching of the church and the grace of God? So he takes a very careful and nuanced approach to that. He doesn't slam the door completely, but nor does he open it wide open to everybody just to rush to the communion rail to receive Holy Communion.
Bishop Tobin, what's his position on contraception? Because it sounds like he's not dismissing the idea of Catholics using contraception.
Well, I think the Holy Father is very clear about affirming the constant teaching of the Church about contraception, that it is immoral, that it is wrong. However, again, he's saying that this is an area where couples have to use their prudence and their discretion while also being mindful of the teachings of the Church. He has a very telling line. He says the role of the church is to inform conscience and not to replace it. In other words, we have to help people make good decisions about this issue and all these issues. While we cannot discount the teaching of Christ in the church, we have to accompany people as they deal with this on an individual level. So again, it's a very careful and prudent and nuanced approach that the Pope really has become famous for. One of the things about the document, too, that's very interesting is that its scope, its breadth. He talks about, obviously, marriage and family, about the intimacy in marriage. He talks about child raising and way parents should react to children. He talks about abortion and gender theory. He covers so many things in this document. That's why it's going to take weeks and months to completely read it, first of all, and to understand it and reflect upon it.
I know it's hard to say now because this is so new, but how big of an impact do you think this will have on the Catholic Church? You know, this idea of welcoming and allowing new people to feel welcome in the church?
Well, in the short term, I'm not sure that it'll have any noticeable impact in the short term, because certainly people who are described in the document have been welcomed in the church already. But I think in the long run, it will have a tremendous impact. As I said, it's a blueprint for us going forward. It's a foundation on which we can build. So I think in the weeks and months and even years to come, people will be reading and studying this document and trying to understand completely what it says. And remember, too, this is not the only important document the Holy Father has given to us recently. A few months ago, he gave us Laudato Si, about the care for our planet and the environment. And before that, he gave us his encyclical on the joy of the gospel, which is really his Magna Carta, his blueprint for his pastoral ministry. The Pope has given us so many things to read and to think about and talk about. It's almost hard to keep up with it, but this is the issue du jour. This is the one that really grabs our attention now. And we need to pay attention to this without discounting everything else the Holy Father has done. The other thing to note is that he does not chart a completely new course. He builds very strongly, and you'll see all the footnotes and references in the document. Pope Francis builds very strongly on the teaching of Pope Benedict, his predecessor, and St. John Paul, the previous Pope. He incorporates the teachings of the Church in his document very beautifully and very powerfully. There are 300 and some footnotes contained in the document. So along with 200 and some pages and 300 and some paragraphs, there are 300 and some footnotes. It's a doctoral dissertation. It's a very long thesis. It's not the kind of thing we can talk about today and think that it's done tomorrow.
So the Pope in this document does not give, maybe direct orders is not the right word, but he doesn't directly what to do, what to change, and so on. He very much leaves it up to the bishop and the cardinals and other church leaders to see how best to implement it in their particular community, in keeping in mind culture and what else is going on inside that community. Is that a problem for you, that there's less guidance? Do you like it better that you can build upon this and have a task force and see how best to implement it? Were you surprised that there was little guidance?
No. One of the things the Pope does say is that every situation is a little bit different, and the circumstances in various nations and regions and cultures can vary, that have to be taken into account. And when we apply the principles of his letter, we have to be mindful of individual situations and circumstances and the local conditions. And that's not terribly new either. I think the Church has a long practice of explaining our fundamental doctrines and teachings, but also then applying them to particular situations. So even though the Pope might be a little bit more specific than we've been in the past, the fundamental approach, I don't think has changed at all. The Pope, I think the ultimate reading of this document says that what the Pope is saying is that the process, in some ways, is more important than the final product, because he's talking about accompanying people in their real life situations, of supporting them, of encouraging them, of welcoming them into the community of the Church, of that process of discernment and integration into the life of the Church he talks about so often, not just in this document, but throughout his pontificate. He's very much a man, I think, who's involved and concerned about the process. How do we deal with issues? How do we relate to people? And not just the sterile teachings and doctrine of the Church. And I think that's very clear in this. It's all about process and discernment and accompanying people, and not just about the teachings and doctrines of the Church. But we cannot ignore or discard those teachings and doctrines either.
And just trying to clarify, and again, I know this is very new, for divorced Catholics that have either not remarried or remarried that may be reading, watching this later, what should they know? I mean, what is changed? I know you said you still have to dissect this, and this is a long-term, this is long-term.
Yes.
But what specifically does this mean to them? How will this affect them now?
I don't know. In terms of their daily practice right now, it makes a lot of difference. First of all, those who are divorced have always been welcome into the life of the Church and to receive the sacraments. If a Catholic is divorced and gets remarried civilly, without the benefit of an annulment, then traditionally they have not been able to receive Holy Communion. The Pope maintains that basic discipline, but he also says that each couple, each individual, has to deal with this process of discretion and reflection and prayer to find out how they can best fit into the life of the church. So in practical terms, for couples who are divorced and remarried, I would encourage them to take up the Pope's challenge, to think about their situation, to pray about it, to deal with their pastor or priest in a pastoral situation, and see where this leads them. The Holy Father, in one of the footnotes that's become one of the benchmarks of the document, says that their participation in the life of the church might also include the sacramental liturgical life, including confession and Holy Communion. Now, that's somewhat obscure, somewhat buried in a footnote, but that's an important point the Holy Father makes as it goes through the document, that while the basic teaching of the church has not changed, every situation is different, and couples have to go through this process of prayerful discretion to see where that might lead them into the life of the church. So it opens the door a little bit, but doesn't throw it wide open either. But he's giving a lot of credence, a lot of credibility to the conscience of each individual, but conscience that's informed by and guided by the church. Saying that we rely on conscience does not throw out the teachings of Christ. It does not throw out the teachings of the church. But we believe the teachings of Christ, the teachings of the church, form the context in which people can form their conscience. So that they're not just doing it in the abstract. They're not just making a decision in a vacuum, but they have something to guide them. And the Holy Father is trying to strike that balance. But it's tough. It's a tough road.
Bishop Tobin, the Pope says the church can no longer sit in judgment. Over the years, has that been a concern that you've heard from parishioners, that the church is too quick to judge? And if so, how do you think we've seen a shift in the perception with Pope Francis?
Well, that's one of those questions I think you'll find people lined up on a couple sides of the divide. There are some people who say the church has been too judgmental and that we're too harsh with people. On the other hand, we have people saying the church has an obligation from God to present our teachings and our moral teachings and our obligations, and if we don't teach those, if we don't proclaim those, then we're not fulfilling our obligation. So there are different ways of perceiving that. We don't want to judge people necessarily in their own personal spiritual journey or the conscience, but we do have an obligation to proclaim the teachings of the church, the teachings of Christ. Otherwise, we're not fulfilling our obligation. So there's a balance there. How does the church teach about marriage, as we have from Christ, without distancing or offending people who are divorced? How do we teach about the evils of contraception without distancing or offending people who have chosen to practice that? How do we teach about the sinfulness of homosexual activity without harming or offending those who may have a same-sex orientation? That is always a balance, always a question for the church, as it was for Jesus. Jesus was very clear to say to people that your sins are forgiven, but he also said to them, go and sin no more. So he would challenge people to do better and to grow in their spiritual life while also forgiving them and walking with them. It's a tough balance. Okay. One or two more questions, then maybe we can wrap it up.
Good.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming. And thanks for being here today to report on an interesting issue.